Tonight we slip into the shadowed stillness of a samurai estate. The tatami mats creak softly under your steps, the air heavy with the faint aroma of green tea and polished cedar. On a low lacquered shelf, a row of teapots sits, glinting in the glow of paper lanterns. But not just any teapots. These are curiously small, some no bigger than the palm of your hand. At first glance you might laugh. They look more suited for dolls than hardened warriors who carried steel at their hips. And yet, to a samurai, these odd little vessels carried a weight that even swords could not. You lean closer, the candlelight flickering across their glossy surfaces, and wonder why a warrior obsessed with honour and death would treasure something so tiny. You probably won't survive this, at least not in the way you imagine, because navigating samurai culture is like walking barefoot across hot coals while balancing a bowl of steaming tea. One false step, one misplaced word, and your fate could be sealed. But tonight, your only task is listening, easing into the tale of why Japan's fiercest fighters collected absurdly small teapots as though their souls depended on it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and your local time down in the comments. I always love seeing where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand in the silent estate listening to the night insects outside as the story begins. The first small teapots appear not in Japan, but across the sea in China. There, during the Song dynasty, tea was ground into fine powder, whisked into foaming bowls, and poured with elegance from vessels that shrank in size the more refined the ritual became. Monks returning from their pilgrimages to China carried these practices back across the water, and the Japanese elite, including samurai, were instantly intrigued. It wasn't enough to win a battle with swords. Mastery of the tea bowl and the pot became a battlefield of its own. Historians still argue whether the earliest Japanese tea utensils were direct imports or carefully copied imitations. Some claim the first too small to function pots were kiln accidents from Chinese porcelain workshops, prized precisely because they looked unusual. Others suggest Zen monks deliberately sought smaller pots to symbolize restraint, turning them into metaphors for discipline. Either way, when the warriors saw them, they leaned in like curious cats at the sight of a dangling string. Imagine a samurai general, fresh from a bloody skirmish, setting aside his armour and cradling a pot scarcely big enough to water a bonsai. The irony bites. A man who could cleave a rival in two now fussing over a porcelain jug the size of a fist. And yet, this was no contradiction. The samurai believed that to master the sword one must also master the stillness of pouring tea. The smaller the vessel, the greater the concentration demanded. It became a contest of grace, as though the entire world could be held in a pot the size of an orange. Of course, let's not romanticize too much. At times these tiny pots were also status symbols, used to show off at lavish gatherings. Guests would pretend to admire the delicate spout and glaze, all while silently comparing who had the rarer piece. You can almost picture it. Hardened warriors trying to outdo each other over who had the smallest pot, when the rest of the world was worrying about rice harvests or Mongol invasions. Still, as you glance at the row of teapots lined before you in that candlelit room, you sense something deeper. Each pot is a whisper of discipline, artistry, and perhaps even rebellion against the chaos of a warrior's life. By shrinking the vessel, the samurai magnified their own need for order, and so the collection began, not with blood or steel, but with porcelain no bigger than your hand. You trail further along the corridor, the night pressing gently against the paper windows, and your guide through this tale nudges you back a few centuries. Before the samurai ever cradled their toy-sized pots, the story of tea itself had to cross oceans. The roots, as with so many cultural treasures, begin in China. There, tea was not yet the everyday convenience of a tea bag dunked in hot water. Instead, it was ceremony, meditation, and in some cases, a display of scholarly refinement. During the Tang dynasty, tea was pressed into bricks, boiled in kettles, and flavoured with herbs or even salt. But by the Song dynasty, the practice shifted toward whisking powdered tea into a froth, what you would recognise as the direct ancestor of modern Japanese matcha. The vessels that accompanied this ritual were carefully proportioned. Some were ordinary in size, meant for households, but others became deliberately compact, delicate enough to fit neatly into a monk's sleeve when travelling. Imagine a pilgrim wandering mountain passes, a scroll in one hand, a pot in the other, though not a pot for soup or stew, but one only big enough to trickle a stream of emerald liquid. You feel the absurd practicality. If the teapot were any larger, the monk would need a mule, any smaller, and it would be mistaken for a thimble. Historians still argue whether Japanese monks deliberately exaggerated the heightened smallness when they brought the vessels back, or whether it was simply a fashion trend imported wholesale. Some scholars point to temple inventories that mention palm-sized kettles as early as the 12th century. Others insist that this is just poetic language and not evidence of actual miniatures. You'll find academic conferences where men in tweed jackets practically duel with footnotes over the size of medieval ceramics. Which is more dramatic? 2 samurai clashing with katanas, or 2 historians arguing about whether a teapot measured 3 inches or 4? What's not debated is that once these items crossed the sea, they caught the attention of the warrior class. Samurai were fascinated by all things Chinese, calligraphy, ink paintings, lacquerware, and of course tea. It wasn't just curiosity, it was prestige. To hold something foreign was to show your wealth, your connection, and your refinement. And if that foreign object happened to be laughably tiny, all the better. You could pretend that your taste was so elevated, so spiritually disciplined, that you didn't need a pot big enough for a proper drink. Picture a feudal lord summoning his retainers for a demonstration. He places a pot on the tatami, barely large enough to fill one delicate cup. The retainers lean in, suppressing the urge to chuckle. Their master pours, the liquid trickling out like a reluctant faucet. But no one dares laugh, because in that moment, the Lord is demonstrating not only his taste, but his connection to a global cultural current. In a world where isolation was the norm, the smallest pot could announce, "I have the world in my palm." Of course, there's also a quirkier angle. Traders on Chinese shores sometimes sold off kill mishaps, pieces that warped or shrank unexpectedly in the firing. To a Chinese merchant, these were rejects. To a Japanese noble, they looked exotic and perfect. It's the same logic that makes some modern collectors pay fortunes for misprinted stamps or upside-down coins. One person's defect becomes another person's treasure, and the samurai were no exception. So when you gaze upon that tiny pot in the lantern-lit room, remember it wasn't born in Japan's soil. It travelled across waters, rode in the sleeves of monks, and perhaps even slipped through the hands of traders who had no idea their mistake would become a warrior's prize. The story of these small pots is, from the beginning, a story of cultural borrowing, one that would soon take on a life of its own in the hands of men who wielded swords by day and porcelain miniatures by night. You linger in the samurai residence, your gaze moving from the pots to the hanging scrolls, and the story pulls you toward the monks who first carried tea into the warrior world. These men were not warriors themselves, at least not with steel. They fought with silence, with breath, with the steady rhythm of sitting still for hours on end. Zen Buddhism had already made its way to Japan, whispering the idea that truth could be found not in books or debates, but in a single clear moment, like watching steam curl from a teacup. It was these monks who introduced tea not as a casual drink, but as a discipline. Imagine the daily grind of meditation, hours on end, unmoving, eyes half shut, the body rebelling with fatigue. Now imagine a bitter, grassy potion to whisk to a froth, taken in small sips from a pot so small you could clutch it like a worry stone. That jolt of caffeine was no accident. It became a tool to stay awake, to sharpen focus, to keep the mind from sliding into drowsy stupor. Historians still argue whether the monks intended tea to be shared widely, or whether it leaked from temple walls into the hands of samurai patrons. Some suggest that the monks were pragmatic, they needed money, and wealthy warriors were eager to fund temples in exchange for exotic goods. Others claim the samurai practically begged for access, seeing the ritual as a way to polish their image. Either way, the moment warriors entered the picture, tea culture took a sharp turn. Because samurai were not content with plain bowls and pots. No, where monks sought simplicity, warriors sought symbols. A pot could no longer be just a pot, it had to show something about who you were. The smaller it was, the more it hinted at control. If a man could command soldiers across provinces yet still kneel before a teapot no bigger than a rice ball, wasn't that proof of discipline? You picture a scene, a monk in his humble robe whisking tea in a quiet temple corner. Beside him, a young samurai kneels, sword at his side, eyes fixed on the miniature pot. The monk pours, and the warrior accepts, bowing slightly. The steam rises, and for a moment both man of prayer and man of war are bound by the same gesture, waiting for the trickle of green liquid from a vessel that seems too small for the task. Here's the quirky tidbit. Records tell us that some samurai practiced mock battles of pouring. Two warriors would kneel with tiny pots racing to fill cups without spilling a drop. The one who spilled first endured ridicule, while the victor enjoyed the smug satisfaction of proving his hand was steadier than his rivals. Forget clashing swords, sometimes ego was bruised more deeply by tea than by steel. The adoption of tea by warriors also had a darker undertone. During long campaigns, generals used tea rituals to steady their nerves before battle. It wasn't just caffeine, it was theatre. A way to remind soldiers that their leaders were calm, composed, and above the chaos. A general sipping from a thimble-sized pot before charging into combat. That was power on display, subtle but unmistakable. You breathe in, hearing the faint hiss of the kettle in your imagination. The samurai were never far from death, but the monks had given them a new tool. Small teapots as vessels of stillness. And in that blend of Zen silence and warrior discipline, the obsession with miniature porcelain found fertile ground, sprouting like moss along the stones of a temple path. Your eyes adjust to the dim lantern glow, and the rows of little pots before you seem to shrink further, as though daring you to laugh at their size. You can't help it. Why on earth would a warrior, fierce and scarred from battle, treasure something that looks fit only for pouring tea into a dollhouse cup? Yet that absurd smallness was precisely the point. In the world of samurai, where every gesture could become a display of power, even the size of a teapot carried meaning. You imagine the scene, a lord hosting a tea gathering, his retainers kneeling in disciplined silence. The pot he places on the tatami is so tiny that even a polite cough might send it skittering across the floor. He pours, and the spout trembles, releasing barely 2 swallows into a guest's cup. The room holds its breath, not because the tea tastes extraordinary, but because the size itself is a performance. It says, I need nothing grand, I can master myself with this. Historians still argue whether samurai deliberately commissioned miniature teapots as symbols of austerity, or whether they simply enjoyed the novelty. Some scrolls describe the pot no larger than a sparrow's egg as a sign of refined taste. Others hint that rival lords mocked one another behind closed doors, suggesting that tiny pots were overcompensation, like buying an impractically small sports car today. The debate lingers. Were the pots metaphors for restraint, or were they just fashionably ridiculous? Quirky tidbit. Some collections included pots so small they were stored in ornate boxes bigger than the pots themselves. Imagine untying silk cords, lifting lids, unwrapping layers of brocade, only to find a vessel scarcely larger than a walnut. Guests would gasp, not always from admiration but sometimes from suppressed laughter. Yet the ritual of unveiling reinforced the pot's importance. Its very smallness demanded drama. Samurai believed that controlling one's desires was the highest virtue. If you could feel satisfied with 2 drops of tea, what else might you conquer? Hunger, fear, even the looming shadow of death. In this sense, the absurd size of the pot became a daily rehearsal of self-control. The smaller the vessel, the greater the discipline. But of course, not everyone agreed. Picture the servants muttering outside the tea room, trading jokes about how their master could conquer a province but couldn't pour a full cup without refilling a pot 5 times. To them, the obsession seemed silly, yet they too understood the stakes. Ridicule a samurai's pot openly, and you might find yourself assigned to shovel horse manure for the rest of the year. You glance again at the miniature teapot glowing in lantern light, and its message becomes clearer. Smallness was not weakness here. It was theatre, philosophy, and sometimes even comedy rolled into porcelain. For a samurai, owning a tiny pot was a way of saying, "I have mastered abundance by needing only a little." You lean closer to the shelves, and if you listen carefully, you can almost hear the ghosts of kilns crackling, the artisans who made these tiny pots whispering their secrets through clay and fire. The samurai might have been the collectors, but the true drama often unfolded in the workshops where craftsmen competed to outdo one another. In Kyoto and Seto, kiln smoke rose like dragon breath, and within those walls potters argued over glazes, spouts and shapes. If one master unveiled a pot the size of a sparrow's nest, another would respond with one scarcely larger than a plum pit. You can almost imagine the rivalry. Clay-covered hands slamming on workbenches, apprentices sent scurrying to fetch brushes no bigger than needles. A potter might even boast, "We'll craft a vessel so small, the samurai will need tweezers to pour from it." Historians still argue whether this competitive shrinking was fueled by actual demand from lords or simply by artisans showing off their technical prowess. Some scholars suggest wealthy patrons commissioned smaller and smaller pieces as a kind of game, an early form of conspicuous consumption. Others insist the trend began with potters themselves, who sought to prove mastery by bending clay to absurd extremes. It remains unclear which came first, the samurai's obsession or the artisan's innovation. Quirky tidbit. Records tell us of a Kyoto artisan who accidentally shrank his pot too far in the kiln, producing a vessel so tiny it fit inside a lacquered snuff box. Instead of discarding it, he wrapped it in silk and presented it to a daimyo as the pot that pours dreams. The lord was delighted, not least because it baffled his guests. Soon, accidental miniatures became desirable, and some potters deliberately manipulated firings to create unpredictable sizes. The rivalry didn't just stay in the workshops. Potters courted patrons like samurai courted allies, and entire lineages rose or fell based on whether their kilns could produce the smallest, most flawless pots. Apprentices risked their livelihoods, sometimes sneaking into rival workshops at night to spy on glaze recipes, or firing techniques. If you think corporate espionage is a modern invention, think again. Centuries ago, secrets of how to shrink a teapot without it collapsing in the kiln could be worth a fortune. Picture a market day in Kyoto. Stalls filled with everyday wares, bowls, plates, jars big enough for rice. Yet in the corner, a small crowd gathers around a display case. Inside rests a pot smaller than a persimmon, its glaze shimmering like frozen dew. Samurai lean in, whispering, bargaining, their voices tense. The artisan stands proudly, knowing that one sale could secure his family's fortune for a year. You step back and see the absurdity. In a time when peasants struggled for enough rice to survive, warriors and artisans alike poured energy into making and collecting vessels too small to satisfy even a sparrow's thirst. Yet that was the paradox. In a world of violence and scarcity, the samurai cultivated meaning in the tiniest luxuries, and behind their obsession were potters locked in rivalries, each determined to make a pot just a little smaller, a little finer than the rest. Your gaze lingers on a single pot, so small it could vanish into your sleeve if you weren't careful, and in its fragile curve you begin to see the deeper philosophy, the belief that these odd little vessels symbolized control. A samurai might swing a sword with enough force to split a helmet, but the true test of discipline was to pour tea from a pot no larger than a clenched fist without spilling a drop. In the warrior's world, control was everything. Control of the battlefield, control of one's retainers, control of one's own impulses. Bushido, the so-called way of the warrior, emphasized mastery over self, anger restrained, appetite curtailed, fear suppressed. A small teapot became a kind of stage for rehearsing this ideal. If you could pour with grace from a vessel that seemed almost mocking in its stinginess, you proved to yourself and to others that you had conquered excess. Historians still argue whether the samurai genuinely believed in the symbolic weight of these pots, or whether it was a fashion retroactively dressed in philosophy. Some scholars argue that the whole thing was a form of conspicuous consumption, cloaked in Zen rhetoric to make it seem noble. Others insist warriors truly saw the act as training, that patience, balance, and control could be sharpened in something as simple as serving tea. The debate is lively enough that even today, academics sip their conference tea a little too thoughtfully, as though daring their cup to reveal the answer. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some manuals from the Edo period include instructions on how to kneel and pour tea from a miniature pot while armoured. Imagine the absurdity. Layers of iron and silk creaking as a warrior leans forward, gauntleted fingers carefully adjusting a pot the size of a peach. It reads like parody, but it was dead serious. If you could handle a delicate pour while wrapped in metal, you could surely handle yourself in battle. Picture it. A general, fresh from drilling his troops, kneeling in the dim glow of lantern light. His retainers watch as he steadies his breathing, his hand hovering over a pot so tiny the spout looks like a sparrow's beak. He tilts, a thin stream of jade-green liquid slips out, and the room is silent until the last drop falls perfectly into a cup. No spill, no tremor. In that moment, the general is not a man of blood and steel, he is control incarnate. You can't help but grin at the irony. In a world of warlords and rebellions, political assassinations and sieges, one of the ultimate signs of discipline was not cleaving through an enemy line, but managing to pour 2 mouthfuls of tea without sloshing it on the tatami. Yet that was the heart of samurai culture, the blending of ferocity and refinement, of chaos and stillness. The oddly small teapots, ridiculous as they may appear, became silent proof that a warrior's greatest battle was often fought not on the field, but within. The faint rattle of armour echoes in your imagination now, and suddenly you are no longer in a quiet estate but crouched inside a canvas war tent pitched on a damp soil. Outside, the air is heavy with the smell of horses and sweat, while distant torches flicker against the night sky. And there, in the heart of the camp, a samurai general kneels by a brazier. The fire crackles, a kettle steams, and from his travel chest he draws, not a grand iron pot, but a miniature teapot, delicate enough to look absurd in such a brutal setting. It is here that the samurai found another use for small teapots. They were portable tranquility, little anchors of ritual in the middle of chaos. Imagine the scene, the clamour of soldiers sharpening blades, the dull thud of carpenters hammering defences, and then, in the midst of it, a quiet circle where tea is poured in near silence. Each drop is a reminder that discipline and calm are as vital as swords and arrows. Historians still argue whether tea ceremonies in war camps were truly common, or whether surviving accounts exaggerate them. Some chronicles describe generals pausing before major battles to drink tea with their retainers, the tiny pots acting as sacred objects of composure. Others suggest these moments were rare luxuries, more symbolic than routine, dramatized in later retellings to romanticize the warrior ideal. Whatever the truth, the image endures. Soldiers outside grow restless, but inside the tent, porcelain no larger than a sparrow's nest commands absolute stillness. Quirky tidbit. A 16th century anecdote tells of a samurai who insisted on brewing tea with his travel-sized pot while under enemy fire. Arrows rattled the tent walls, dust fell from the rafters, and still he calmly poured. His men reportedly gained courage simply by watching him, convinced that if their lord could keep steady hands in such absurd conditions, then surely the gods were on their side. It may sound theatrical, but morale is often stitched together by such strange acts of composure. Think of the logistics, a war chest packed with maps, armour and food, yet space always reserved for a small brazier, a pouch of powdered tea, and one comically tiny pot wrapped in cloth. Soldiers might go without sleep or comfort, but their lord would carry porcelain, as if to remind them that war did not erase culture, it heightened the need for it. And so, as you crouch in that imagined tent, you feel the paradox. Outside chaos and fear, inside the delicate trickle of tea from a pot barely bigger than your fist. The samurai's obsession with small teapots was not simply aesthetic, it was survival of the spirit. For in the smallest vessels they found the largest calm. The night grows quieter as you picture the campfires fading, and your mind drifts to a less obvious use for those tiny vessels, one whispered in stories that may or may not be true. For all their porcelain grace, some of these teapots were said to carry more than tea. They became tools of secrecy, even of espionage. Imagine a samurai court where rivals bowed politely across tatami mats, all smiles and compliments, while beneath the surface brewed suspicion. What better place to hide a message than in an object no one dared to mock? A small teapot could be slipped into a lacquered box, carried by a servant, and presented as a gift. Inside, folded tight, might be a secret letter. Some tales even suggest powders, poisons, herbs, or coded mixtures could be sealed in false bottoms, travelling safely under the guise of innocent tea utensils. Historians still argue whether these spy stories are fact or fable. There are no definitive records of teapots being used as dead drops or containers for poison. Some scholars insist the whole idea is later invention, spun, to add mystique to collections. Others point to circumstantial evidence, confiscated items in castle inventories, strange pots with unusually thick bases, notes about hollow wares. It remains one of those delightful uncertainties where history winks at us and refuses to clarify. Here's the quirky tidbit. One Edo-era tale claims a daimyo once sent a rival a gift of teapots, each one absurdly small. Hidden inside the tiniest was not a letter, but a pinch of gunpowder, meant not for use as a weapon, but as a mocking symbol. Even your power could vanish in a puff. Whether true or not, the story circulated widely, and samurai began checking their miniature treasures more carefully before setting them on the shelf. You picture yourself in such a hall, retainers standing guard, lacquered boxes opened, the master lifting out a fragile teapot no larger than a quail's egg. His fingers turn it over, testing its weight, ears pricked for the faint rattle of something hidden inside. Around him, silence tightens. Is it just porcelain, or is it something more? Of course, most pots held nothing but the possibility of calm. but the whispers of hidden codes and secret powders gave them an added aura, turning each miniature vessel into not just a symbol of refinement but a vessel of mystery. And in a warrior culture where suspicion was as common as steel, that mystery was sometimes more powerful than truth. You return now to the warmth of a grand estate hall, the air heavy with incense and soft candlelight. The noise of the battlefield is far away, replaced by the hush of a formal tea gathering. Here, status is measured not by scars or trophies of war, but by refinement, and nothing revealed a lord's taste quite like the size of his teapot. Picture it. The host sits calmly, his lacquered shelves lined with treasures. When the time comes to prepare tea, he deliberately chooses the tiniest pot from his collection, so delicate it could be mistaken for a child's toy. He pours slowly, each guest receiving only a swallow or two. The guests nod gravely, though in their minds they calculate whose pot is rarer, whose glaze is finer, whose vessel is smaller. This wasn't about drinking tea, it was a contest played in porcelain inches. Historians still argue how much weight these displays truly carried. Some suggest tea gatherings were primarily aesthetic and social, with size being one of many elements of taste. Others claim the dimension of the pot itself became a subtle language of power, a way to humiliate or impress rivals without a word. Was the smallest pot truly a badge of discipline, or was it simply another tool in the endless samurai game of one-upmanship? No consensus exists, and perhaps that ambiguity was part of the appeal. A quirky tidbit survives in diaries of the era. Some lords secretly mocked rivals who used pots that were too practical. A vessel that poured generously was considered gauche, almost vulgar. The true elite flaunted inconvenience, making guests wait through multiple refills just to sip half a cup. Imagine the awkward silence as a warrior lord stops mid-sentence to refill a guest's cup for the third time, his smile betraying the smug thought, "Yes, this proves my refinement." To be seen at such a gathering was to enter a silent tournament. Every bow, every sip, every glance toward a porcelain pot carried meaning. And while swords clashed in the open field here, in the flickering intimacy of the tea room, reputations rose and fell on the trickle of green tea from a spout no larger than a sparrow's beak. Your steps echo softly across polished floorboards, and now you find yourself in a side chamber, where treasures are displayed not for use, but for admiration. Rows of lacquered shelves gleam under candlelight, each holding teapots so small you almost squint to see them. Some are shaped like tiny gourds, others resemble squat bells, and a few are so perfectly round they look like polished river stones with spouts. This was the other life of the miniature teapot, not as a tool but as a showpiece. Samurai lords often kept cabinets of curiosities, filled with items collected from across Japan and beyond. Chinese scrolls, Korean ceramics, shells from distant coasts, even strange stones plucked from rivers. Among them, the oddly small teapots took pride of place. They weren't always meant to brew tea. Sometimes they were simply objects of wonder. A guest might be invited to lean in, examine the glaze, marvel at the pot's perfect balance despite its absurd size. In a culture where understatement was prized, these tiny treasures shouted with their silence. Historians still argue whether the collecting of miniature teapots was primarily about personal appreciation or about impressing visitors. Some records suggest samurai handled them alone in quiet moments, almost like meditation beads, enjoying their form in solitude. Others describe elaborate viewing sessions where lords unveiled their collections with the pomp of stage magicians. Was it introspection or spectacle? The truth probably varied from household to household, and perhaps that was part of their charm. The pots could mean whatever their owners needed them to mean. Here's the quirky tidbit. One lord supposedly owned a pot so small it fit neatly inside a seashell. He kept both in a box, and when showing off to guests, He'd open the shell to reveal the pot, as though nature itself had birthed it. Guests were stunned, some even writing poems in praise of the seashell that poured tea. Was the pot practical? Absolutely not. Did it cement the Lord's reputation as a man of rare taste? Without question. You can imagine wandering such a display room yourself, candlelight flickering across rows of impossibly delicate pots. Each one tells a story of travel, rivalry, or accident. Some were bought for fortunes, others stumbled upon in markets, perhaps once considered rejects. But on the shelves of samurai, they gleamed like jewels. To collect was to proclaim, I have the power to treasure what others overlook. And so in these cabinets the teapots transcended utility altogether. They became symbols, curiosities, conversation starters, and silent trophies, measured not in how much tea they poured, but in how much awe they inspired. The lantern light flickers, and now your eyes are drawn to colours glinting from the miniature pots. Glazes of jade green, deep cobalt blue, and even pale creams flecked with tiny cracks like frozen lightning. These hues didn't all come from Japan's soil. Many were the result of imported knowledge, pigments, and techniques carried across seas by merchants and envoys. In their smallness, the teapots became canvases for international influence. When Japan opened its ports to trade with China and Korea, artisans gained access to exotic minerals and glazing techniques. Cobalt from Persia, channeled through Chinese kilns, eventually trickled into Japanese workshops. A pot no bigger than a peach might shimmer with blue patterns, first born in the deserts of Central Asia. To a samurai, owning such a piece meant more than possessing porcelain. It meant holding the world's trade routes in the palm of your hand. Historians still argue how much foreign influence truly shaped Japanese miniature teapots. Some insist that most techniques were local innovations, inspired by imports but adapted quickly into a Japanese style. Others argue that without those imported glazes and colours, the craze for oddly small pots might never have taken hold, since their brilliance owed much to global exchange. The debate often narrows to one question. Were samurai collecting Japanese art or international fusion in porcelain disguise? Quirky tidbit. A record from the 17th century tells of a daimyo who hosted a gathering where each guest had to identify the origin of the glaze on his tiny pots. Those who guessed wrong had to drink bitter, overbrewed tea as a playful punishment. The challenge became infamous, part art critique, part party game, and lords competed to showcase pots with the most confusing, dazzling colours. Imagine a warrior lord stern as stone in battle, smirking as a rival chokes down an extra bitter sip for mistaking Korean celadon for Chinese. In these imported hues you glimpse a paradox. Miniature teapots were intensely local, tied to Japanese culture and samurai philosophy, and yet they were global artifacts too, vessels glazed by minerals and methods that travelled thousands of miles. As you stare at a palm-sized pot glowing in cobalt blue, you realise it is not merely a relic of a warrior's refinement, but also a tiny map of the world, painted, fired, and poured one thimbleful at a time. The air in the chamber feels warmer now, as if you can almost sense the heat of ancient kilns breathing through the walls. For all the samurai's deliberate philosophies and artisans' careful skill, many of the tiniest teapots were born not of intention, but of accident. Clay shrinks when fired, and sometimes it shrinks too much. A vessel that began as modestly small emerged from the kiln comically miniature, as though the fire had conspired with gravity to mock the potter's ambition. In most cases, such warped pieces would have been tossed aside. Yet somewhere along the line a lord looked at one of these accidents and thought, this is perfect. What should have been a reject suddenly became a prize. And so kiln mishaps turned into treasures and potters learned that mistakes could be as valuable as masterpieces. Historians still argue how deliberate this became. Some believe artisans learned to manipulate firing temperatures and clay composition precisely to force shrinkage, courting those odd dimensions that samurai craved. Others insist the effect was largely random, and that potters simply got lucky when the fire worked in their favour. The truth is hazy, buried in fragments of kiln logs and oral traditions. It leaves you wondering, were samurai paying fortunes for skill or for chance? Here's the quirky tidbit. A tale survives of a Seto potter who presented a daimyo with a pot so tiny it balanced on a single coin. The lord was delighted, declaring that the gods themselves must have kissed the clay. In truth, the potter had simply miscalculated his mixture of ash glaze, which caused extra shrinkage. But far be it from him to admit that he accepted the Lord's praise, pocketed the payment, and began accidentally repeating the process. You can imagine the suspense as potters open their kilns, hearts pounding, hoping for miniature miracles. Sometimes a vessel emerged too warped to stand, spouts bent like twisted reeds. Other times perfection appeared. A pot smaller than expected, but balanced, symmetrical, gleaming with glaze. Those moments spread like wildfire, whispered from workshop to castle. So-and-so's kiln has birthed another wonder. And so the samurai's shelves filled not just with deliberate art, but with the happy accidents of fire and clay. Each tiny pot became a reminder that perfection could spring from imperfection, that discipline could be proven even in chaos. A warrior might gaze at such a vessel and see in its smallness the very lesson of his life, that control is never absolute, but beauty can emerge even when the flames misbehave. The room softens around you, as if the hush of parchment and ink has joined the faint shimmer of porcelain. For the samurai, these small teapots weren't just silent trophies, they were muses. Alongside the vessels, scrolls of poetry were often unfurled, words written to capture the essence of something so absurdly delicate. Imagine a warrior, fresh from days of brutal campaigning, kneeling in the quiet of his home. Before him sits a pot so tiny it could rest easily in his palm. He pours, and the steam curls upward like a ghost. Instead of boasting of battles, he reaches for a brush and ink, his hand moving across paper in slow arcs. The verse he writes may not mention swords at all. It might praise the gentle trickle from the sparrow's beak, or the emptiness that fills the smallest cup. Historians still argue whether such poetry was deeply sincere or a fashionable pastime meant to flatter hosts. Some believe samurai truly felt a meditative bond with their pots, weaving metaphors of discipline and transience into every verse. Others suggest the poems were performative, as much a status display as the porcelain itself. After all, what better way to impress guests than to casually compose a haiku about a teapot the size of a walnut? Here's the quirky tidbit. One diary entry tells of a tea gathering where a lord presented a new miniature pot and invited guests to compose poems on the spot. One samurai, apparently lacking inspiration, simply wrote, "Too small for tea, better for ants." The others chuckled politely, but the host, instead of being offended, declared it the most honest poem of the night. That scrap of verse was later preserved with the pot itself, as if the humour was part of its pedigree. You can almost see it. A tea room filled with silence, broken only by the scratch of brushes, each warrior searching for words that balance delicacy with depth. Outside, the world demanded strength and blood. Inside, the ink whispered of smallness, fragility, and the fleeting curl of steam. In these verses, the samurai found another layer of control, not just over swords or porcelain, but over language itself. The tiny teapot became a metaphor, a spark that coaxed warriors to set down steel and pick up ink, leaving behind poems that, like the vessels, endured long after their owners had passed. The silence of the tea room deepens, and now you notice the ritual itself, the act of pouring from a pot so tiny it seems almost comical. For samurai, this wasn't just about possession, it was about performance. The smaller the pot, the more elaborate the etiquette required. Every movement had to be slowed, exaggerated and refined, turning what could have been a 2-second pour into a small drama on tatami mats. Picture the scene. The host kneels, lifting a pot no larger than his fist. He angles it carefully, a thin trickle of green liquid slipping into the guest's cup. But here's the challenge. The cup is larger than the pot's capacity. That means the host must pour again and again. Guests wait in silence as the ritual stretches on, each refill testing the patience and discipline of everyone present. What looks inconvenient is actually intentional. The ceremony forces everyone to slow down, to breathe, to observe. Historians still argue whether these exaggerated rituals were designed to reflect Zen teachings, or whether they were simply another way for lords to flex cultural superiority. Some say the endless refills symbolized life's impermanence, teaching patience with each delayed sip. Others suggest it was more about hierarchy, reminding guests that they were at the mercy of the host's pace. The truth is likely both. Philosophy for the monks, power play for the warriors. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some manuals advised how to bow properly when receiving multiple half-sips of tea. 1 bow per pour was considered excessive, but no bow at all was insulting. The compromise? A subtle incline of the head with each refill. Imagine the absurd ballet, a host refilling 6 times, a guest nodding like a bobbing crane, all while trying not to laugh at the ridiculousness of it. Yet within this ritual lay a serious lesson. To kneel in armour or stiff robes, to balance a vessel that could slip with a twitch, to endure the repeated pouring without complaint, these were exercises in composure. A samurai might face chaos on the battlefield, but in the tea room he learned to control not just his sword hand, but his breath, his gaze, even his impatience. And so what looked like a farce became a philosophy. The smaller the pot, the greater the patience demanded. In those moments of slow, deliberate pouring, the samurai rehearsed not just etiquette but endurance, the art of finding calm even when the cup is never quite full. The lantern light glints on porcelain, and now you sense another layer to the story. This wasn't just about rituals and philosophy. Collecting oddly small teapots became a contest of pride, and the rivalries it sparked could be as sharp as any drawn blade. Samurai who once duelled with swords now found themselves measuring spouts and weighing glaze thickness, all to prove who had the most refined taste. Picture a gathering where 2 lords unveil their latest acquisitions. One produces a pot the size of a sparrow's egg, perfectly glazed, perfectly balanced. The other, not to be outdone, reveals one even smaller, no bigger than a quail's yolk. Gasps ripple through the room. Guests lean closer, trying to hide their smirks as they silently crown the victor of this absurd duel. Nobody bleeds, but reputations are cut deep. Historians still argue whether these rivalries were friendly competitions or if they carried real political weight. Some scholars suggest the contests were playful diversions, a way for warriors to channel their egos without drawing swords. Others argue that prestige gained from such displays could sway alliances, shaping how peers viewed a lord's refinement, and by extension, his legitimacy. In a culture where appearances mattered as much as victories, even the size of a teapot could ripple through politics. Here's the quirky tidbit. One story tells of a daimyo who became so obsessed with owning the smallest pot that he sent spies to rival provinces, not to steal military secrets, but to discover where their prized pottery was fired. When he finally acquired a pot smaller than his enemies, he reportedly celebrated with a banquet, during which the tiny vessel was displayed on a pedestal like a war trophy. Guests toasted its victory as though it had won a battlefield skirmish. You can almost laugh at the thought. Hardened warriors reduced to porcelain envy, but for them the stakes were no joke. To be mocked for owning a too large teapot was to risk whispers about your lack of discipline or taste. And so, men who led armies obsessed over inches of ceramic, proving once again that pride finds the strangest battlefields. In the end, these rivalries remind you that samurai honor was not only defended in duels or wars, sometimes it was defended across tatami mats, with pots so small that the clash of pride could be heard louder than the pour of tea itself. The glow of the lantern softens, and your gaze drifts from rivalry to reflection. For all the comedy of warriors squabbling over doll-sized vessels, there was also a philosophy at work, one rooted in the Japanese aesthetic of wabi-sabi. This idea celebrated imperfection, transience, and above all the beauty of the modest and small. And what could embody modesty better than a pot that barely filled half a cup? A samurai fresh from the battlefield might enter a tea room and kneel before a vessel no bigger than a plum. Its glaze may show cracks, its handle slightly off-centre, its spout uneven. To the untrained eye these flaws were defects, but to the warrior steeped in wabi-sabi they were lessons. Nothing lasts, nothing is perfect, and that is precisely what makes life beautiful. In the tiny pot he saw a mirror of himself, disciplined, scarred, fragile, and fleeting. Historians still argue whether wabi-sabi truly guided samurai collecting habits, or whether the philosophy was a later interpretation layered onto what began as a fad. Some insist that lords were genuinely moved by imperfection, finding in their pots a refuge from the endless pressure of perfection in war. Others claim it was a justification after the fact, a way to make an eccentric hobby sound spiritual. Like so many things samurai touched, it is hard to tell where sincerity ends and theatre begins. Quirky tidbit. One famous tea master reportedly cracked a prized miniature pot on purpose, claiming it had become too perfect and thus incomplete. His lord, horrified at first, later praised the act as proof of profound understanding. Imagine that, spending a fortune on a pot the size of a fist, only to smash it lightly with a hammer so it could achieve philosophical dignity. You can picture a samurai kneeling in the quiet glow of the tea room, staring at a crack running down the side of his palm-sized pot. Instead of despairing, he feels calmer. The floor whispers, all things pass, even wars. The smallness whispers, contentment comes from needing less. Together they remind him that beauty is not in perfection, but in the fragile trickle of tea from a vessel that seems almost too slight to exist. And so, in their obsession with tiny pots, the samurai weren't only competing or showing off, they were also meditating on life itself. Fragile, fleeting, imperfect, and yet in its own strange way profoundly complete. The lantern's glow steadies, and now your thoughts turn toward the marketplace, where the samurai's obsession spilled into coin and commerce. What began as ritual and philosophy soon created an economy of its own. Oddly small teapots, once kiln mishaps or quirky curiosities, became worth more than some suits of armour, fetching sums that made merchants grin and peasants shake their heads. Picture a bustling Kyoto street, vendors shouting, rice sacks stacked high, silk bolts unfurled. Among the stalls of practical goods sits a quiet booth draped in brocade. Inside, a tiny porcelain pot rests on a cushion, as though it were a jewel. Samurai step forward, their retainers carrying purses heavy with coin. The merchant names a price outrageous enough to make a farmer faint. Yet the warrior nods solemnly and pays as though he were purchasing victory itself. Historians still argue whether these prices reflected genuine scarcity or simple hype. Some claim that true masterworks of miniature pottery required years of skill and so deserved their value. Others believe the craze was artificially inflated, stoked by cunning merchants who preyed on samurai pride. Was it economy or ego that set the price? The debate lingers, much like the memory of the pots themselves. Quirky tidbit. Records tell of a market where a pot small enough to sit on a single coin sold for more than a horse. Another story speaks of a daimyo who traded a parcel of farmland for one teapot he claimed was the size of enlightenment. His peasants, unsurprisingly, were less thrilled by the exchange. Still, to the samurai, land and livestock came and went, but a vessel of rare smallness promised eternal refinement. You might chuckle at the absurdity, but the economic ripple was real. Potters rose to fame, merchants prospered, and common folk watched in disbelief as porcelain no larger than a sparrow's nest dictated fortunes. For the warrior class, money spent on miniature pots wasn't waste. It was investment in reputation, in status, in the theatre of refinement. And so the market thrived, proving that even in an age of swords and rice taxes, luxury could shrink down to the size of a child's toy and still cost a fortune. The glow of the tea room softens, and you notice how the shelves of tiny pots were not always curated by men alone. For all the samurai pride in discipline and austerity, their wives and daughters also shaped these collections, weaving their own tastes and quiet influences into the porcelain rows. In many samurai households, women oversaw the finer details of domestic life, arranging flowers, selecting fabrics, managing tea gatherings, while men displayed their warrior ethos through sword and ceremony. Women often guided the subtler art of taste. A lord might boast of his newest pot, but it was his wife who had chosen the silk wrapping, or his daughter who suggested which glaze looked most refined against lacquered shelves. In this way, the miniature teapots became shared artifacts of family identity. Historians still argue how much credit women deserve in shaping tea culture. Traditional accounts often focus on male warriors and famous tea masters, as though the tea room were a stage where women never appeared. Yet household diaries reveal another story, of wives who advised on purchases, or of daughters who gifted tiny pots to their fathers, elevating their status in ways that official histories barely acknowledge. Was it silent influence or active participation? Scholars continue to debate. Quirky tidbit. One tale tells of a samurai's daughter who commissioned a pot so small it fit in her hair ornament. She unveiled it at a gathering, balancing it on her comb to the laughter and awe of guests. Her father, instead of scolding, praised her wit and added the pot to his collection. From then on, the vessel was known as the hairpin pot, treasured as much for the story as for the porcelain. Picture a wife arranging a tea room before a gathering. She selects which pots to display, perhaps hiding one her husband overvalues and replacing it with another she prefers. Guests later whisper of his refined taste, not realizing they are admiring her choices. In these subtle acts, women shape the narrative of samurai refinement, leaving fingerprints on the very objects that history tends to assign only to men. So as you gaze at the rows of miniature vessels, remember that behind every warrior showing off his porcelain prize, there may have been a quiet hand guiding which pot gleamed in the candlelight that night. The candlelight trembles, and in that flicker you glimpse the slow fading of the craze. For centuries, the tiny teapots commanded attention, wealth, and pride. But fashions shift, even for warriors, and the miniature eventually gave way to the practical once more. Larger kettles, capable of serving not just one delicate sip but whole gatherings, returned to prominence. The question is, why? Some point to the changing political landscape. By the late Edo period, Japan had entered a long era of relative peace. Without constant battles, samurai shifted from warlords to bureaucrats, their lives less defined by the drama of battlefield composure. The need to prove discipline through absurdly small vessels faded, replaced by rituals that emphasized hospitality and efficiency. Pouring endlessly from a pot that barely filled a cup was less appealing in an age of peace and social order. Historians still argue whether the decline was philosophical or economic. Some claim it was simply impractical. Families and guests preferred kettles that could serve more generously. Others suggest it reflected broader cultural shifts as tea gatherings evolved from private arenas of warrior discipline into larger, more communal events. In short, the theatre of smallness no longer fit the mood of the times. Quirky tidbit. One record tells of a tea master who declared the craze over by smashing a famously tiny pot during a gathering, proclaiming, "The world has grown too large for this." Guests gasped. Some laughed nervously, but the gesture captured a truth. The miniature had lost its symbolic weight. Soon after, markets shifted focus to larger wares, and tiny pots began to feel like relics of a bygone eccentricity. Picture a samurai estate where shelves once glittered with rows of palm-sized treasures. Now dust gathers on them while larger kettles steam on the hearth, filling cups with ease. What was once status now seemed outdated, even slightly comical. Guests admired the old pots, yes, but with the air of nostalgia rather than envy. And so the tiny teapots slipped into history's shadows, their reign ending not with a battle but with a yawn. They had served their purpose, symbols of discipline, pride and artistry, but like all fads they eventually bowed out, leaving behind shelves of porcelain memories. The lantern light fades into a gentler glow, and your mind drifts forward, past the age of swords and silk-wrapped shelves, into modern Japan. The battles are long gone, but the miniature teapots have not vanished entirely. Instead, they linger, sometimes in museums, sometimes in the private collections of enthusiasts who still marvel at their delicate absurdity. Step into a Tokyo museum today, and you might find one tucked behind glass, barely bigger than a golf ball. School children press their noses close, laughing at how silly it looks, while curators whisper of its centuries-old pedigree. What was once a symbol of status and discipline is now an object of curiosity, a fragile echo of warrior culture. And yet, as you look, you sense the same quiet gravity that captivated the samurai. Historians still argue whether these modern displays honour genuine tradition or simply preserve an eccentric footnote. Some claim the pots remind Japan of its blending of refinement and ferocity, proof that warriors found peace in the tiniest rituals. Others dismiss them as aristocratic oddities, fascinating but frivolous. The debate continues in university halls, just as it once did in tatami rooms centuries ago. Here's the quirky tidbit. In recent years, a subculture of hobbyists has revived the craft, commissioning new miniature teapots from artisans. Some even host competitions, whose pot can be the smallest yet still pour. Videos of these contests circulate online, a modern echo of ancient rivalries. Imagine a samurai, resurrected in the 21st century, scrolling through a smartphone and nodding approvingly at a pot that pours 3 drops of tea without spilling. And so the legacy of the small teapot endures, not as a craze sweeping provinces, but as a whisper of history kept alive by collectors, artists, and the occasional curious traveller. When you see one today, you don't just see porcelain, you see discipline, rivalry, imperfection, pride, and a touch of humour, all condensed into a vessel you could lose in your pocket. The samurai are gone, but their tiny teapots remain, carrying forward a story that reminds us how even the fiercest warriors found meaning in something as small as a trickle of tea. And now, as the tale of the miniature teapot settles, let your own thoughts grow quieter, smaller and lighter. You've walked through the candle-lit corridors of samurai estates, crouched inside war tents, leaned close to porcelain no bigger than your palm. You've seen how rivalry, philosophy, and even accidents of clay shaped an entire culture's fascination with objects too fragile to survive a fall. But here, in this moment, there is no need for rivalry or discipline. breathe in slowly and exhale a little longer than before. Picture one of those teapots resting in your hand, smooth and cool, its weight almost negligible. As you tilt it, imagine a thin stream of tea pouring into a cup, the sound barely more than a whisper. The cup fills slowly, steadily, without rush. Each drop stretches time, reminding you that nothing needs to be hurried tonight. The room around you dims. The shelves of teapots fade into soft shadows. The air is warm, steady, quiet. You let the samurai's obsession melt into something simpler, a reminder that small things can hold immense calm. Even the tiniest vessel, fragile and fleeting, can carry peace when approached with patience. Your breathing slows, your body loosens. The fan hums softly in the background, a modern echo of the kettle's hiss. The world narrows to stillness, to simplicity, to the soothing rhythm of imagining tea poured drop by drop. The story rests now, the lanterns dim, and your mind drifts like steam curling into the night. Sleep comes gently, like water filling the smallest of cups, quiet, unhurried and complete.